Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another show of the classics. This is your host Umar Khalid. But well, as you know, in our show we try to delve into or try to understand the literature, the films and the poetry of different countries from around the world, and try to understand what the psyche, what the mentality, what the politics of those times were, why those authors or writers or poets wrote what they wrote, and of course the cultural and the social significance of the poetry and the films of that time. Today is no exception, Mr. Peter Hayward. Thank you, sir, to have joined us. Tell me a little bit about Australian poetry, how it all started, and why is there such a deep meaning to Australian poetry. The poets not only talk of romanticism, but they talk a lot about social issues, about personal issues. Why is poetry so personal to Australian poets?
Australia is a young country, as you know, so our tradition of poetry is similar to yours. It comes, the English language anyway, it comes from England and the older colonies, of which the United States is one. So a lot of the traditions stem from that. I mean, our earliest poetry was what's called bush ballads, basically. These are kind of rhythmic, very rhyming verses which tell stories of the early settlements and the trials and tribulations that the people had. But as urban society grew, poetry became more, I guess, an expression of deeper thoughts, a vehicle, as you say, for social commentary, but much more so for reflections about the big questions of life and death, existence. And I think the poet I chose, James Macaulay, is definitely fits into that category. And most contemporary Australian poetry is of that nature. It's reflections on man and his relationship with the world, the natural world, but also the spiritual world.
Mr. Hayward, tell me, the poet that you chose, James Macaulay, and his poem, the first you're going to read to us, I hope.
I will.
It's called Late Winter. Why choose this poet and why choose this poem?
Well, the poet is easy. He was the professor of English at the University of Tasmania when I studied there, so I got to know him personally. Though at that stage it was in the latter part of his life, and he died while I was there as a student.
All right.
He had cancer and died, but he was, I guess, more reflective, less politically active than he had been earlier in his life. The thing that he's most famous for in Australia is, in fact, a literary hoax, which was a poetry hoax. He and a fellow friend put together some poems by randomly taking pieces from other sources, from technical manuals, from newspapers, and putting together as poetry. And they claimed to be a poet called Ern Malley was the name they gave it. Published these poems, and his poetry, as you say, it's not classic in style, but it does observe many of the formatting, the elements of classic poetry. And he was, as a literary professor, he was an academic as well. He certainly knew a lot about English poetry, English language poetry from other parts of the world, and he absorbed that, and that came out in his writings. But he was also a very good teacher. I remember very well his lectures, and he was able to awaken his students, including me, to many aspects of literature.
And I think that is what is the highlight of a good teacher, a good professor. He leaves his mark on his students, and his students still remember him through his works, through what he taught him, and through his poetry. Would you kindly read out the poetry?
I shall. Just one tiny bit. It's only a very short poem,
yes.
But one of the reasons that I remember it so well is that there was a memorial held after he died in the university, and a number of his friends and colleagues came and read poems of his. But the poem that they chose to put on the front of the booklet that was for this event was this poem, and in his own handwriting. So, and I've still got that the form for that memorial event somewhere back in Australia. So, but it's also refers to the natural world, which I think is something that resonates with me. So it's called Late Winter. The pallid cuckoo sent up in frail microtones his tiny scale. On the cold air, what joy I found mounting that tiny stair of sound. So it's very short.
It's very short, but you see, when you go through it again and again, the first time you read it, you say, all right, it seems very simple in the way it's written. You read it again, you say, no, it's not that as simple as you thought it was. You read it a third time, you find different meanings in it. Now, what was your point of view on what the poet was trying to say through this?
Well, it's on the surface, it's about a bird singing and his response to it, but it's a kind of a melancholic sort of an atmosphere to it. It was written late in his life, as I said, when he was sick. He was limited in what he could do, and so it's about what things he found joy in. He was able to sit. I can just imagine him sitting with a blanket over his knees in the winter, hearing this bird singing, and getting joy out of that. I mean, he enjoyed classical music, I know, but this was an everyday thing. So, like a lot of Australian poetry, it's about the relationship of man to the natural world. I think, as I said to you, we're a small population in a vast country. Most Australians know and have some sort of relationship with the natural world. We're not all, even though we live in cities, the edges of the cities are never far away, and so it reflects that. But it's also, I guess, about how you extract beauty and pleasure from other than the constructed world, the built world.
Mr. Hayward, what do you feel about Australian literature coming from an Australian?
Well, clearly, as you said, the origins of Australian literature rest in the United Kingdom, but the existence, the lived experience of Australians is very different from that of people in the United Kingdom. We're a continent of a sized country, a lot of empty areas, a lot of bush, as we call it, the forest. And over time, relationships with the rest of the world have focused less on Europe, less on the United Kingdom, and much more on our neighbourhood of Asia. So over time, Australian literature has also evolved. It's much more looking at the experience of Australians. Like Pakistan, a lot of it is about the nature of the country, what brings us together as a country, what common experiences we have, and increasingly placing us in that Asian world rather than a purely European world.
Ambassador, what is the kind of writing that inspires you as a reader?
I guess I like things that are placed in a context that I can understand. So there's a number of Australian writers who are very definitely writing in an Australian context. You mentioned Peter Carey. I think he's been very good at that. Tim Winton is another one you didn't mention, but he's a more contemporary writer. Murray Ball. There's a range of them, including some of the ones you mentioned. But I like reading things that are consciously Australian in their perspective.
And I like are deep-rooted in
when
Australian
I'm
culture.
reading Australian literature, I like that, of course. If you're reading literature, and part of being here is to read as much Pakistani literature as I can to try and absorb the lessons through that. But yeah, from Australian perspective. But I also like works which the language is important. They're lyrical. There's a certain sort of style about them, so that you can appreciate them just as if you like the language as well as the content. But I'm like anybody else. I like a good story.
That's true.
But I also like multi-layered literature where there's references to other works. There's the messages aren't delivered immediately. You have to work your way through them. Typically, a book I like the best is one which you'd have to read at least twice to really get the best out of.
Well, that's exactly just like the poem that you had chosen. I mean, because it looks very simple on the offset, but when you kind of keep on reading, you kind of find different layers underneath. And this is what is very important for any reader, is to kind of jog his or her mind and try to understand the complexities of literature and poetry. But are you an avid reader?
I am. I'm subject to the same dilemmas that you know. I get up and the first thing I do is read the news to find out what's happening in the world. But I remember being told very early in my working life by a mentor that you should always have some literature in your life as you work, and I still do that. So I'm reading at the moment, and I always do. I find when I take a break from work, when I go and leave, in 2 or 3 weeks, I can read 5 or 6 novels easily. I read a lot when I have the leisure time, but I'm always reading something.
Well, the book that you've chosen for us today, it's called Gould's Book of Fish. It's by a Tasmanian author, Richard Flanagan, of course. Richard Flanagan, a Tasmanian author. The poet was Tasmanian. Aren't you kind
You're getting
to
a
try
theme
to
here.
tell us something that about your origins as well, or are you more attracted to Tasmanian authors?
I think I'm interested in Australian literature per se, but I'm a Tasmanian. I grew up in Tasmania, so people who from there who write, it's only a very small, you know, there's only 500,000 people in the state. So Richard Flanagan, like Macaulay, I went to university with him. He was in Macaulay's lectures.
Oh, all right.
He's a little younger than me, but and his elder brother I knew better. He's a journalist and also very quite prominent in Australian literary circles. But Richard's novels are all set in Australia, in Tasmania, so I understand the context very much.
When you were studying in the same university as him, did you ever get to know that he wanted to become a writer? Was he writing at that time as well?
He was, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say I was a close friend, but he wrote in university magazines, and pretty shortly after university his first novel started to come out. So, and now he's very much not just a literary figure, he's a political figure. He comments on social issues. He still lives in Tasmania, his home is there, but now he's world renowned. He's just won the Man Booker Prize, which is probably the preeminent prize for English literature there, based in the UK, for his latest novel, which I haven't yet read. Maybe I would have chosen that one if I had, but this one, Gould's Book of Fish...
it's got so many awards as well. I mean, you go through the list. It's called the Commonwealth Writers Award, the Southeast Asian, South Pacific Region Best Book Award, the Commonwealth Writers Prize, the Miles Franklin Literary Award. I mean, so many awards, despite the fact that when you go through the title, it really seems like something that's written for maybe the primary section. But when you open it, it's got these 12 titles, and a very interesting thing about the book is that it's got visual imagery.
Yes.
And even, I mean, I would really like you to tell us a little bit about the background of the visual imagery instead of me kind of explaining to the audience.
Well, as I said, I like multi-layered literature, and this is a very multi-layered book. The title, Gould's Book of Fish, refers to an actual person, William Gould, who was an illustrator. But he came to Australia and Tasmania as a convict, like many others did in the early days of the colony. Tasmania was a penal colony. It's where the United Kingdom sent its convicts. So the population consisted of convicts and the military and a small commercial class. So the people guarding the jail, the people in jail, and a few people who sort of helped things happen. Gould was an artist, an etcher, and he did a range of paintings and illustrations of the natural world. But this were particularly pictures of fish. So the book is constructed, the chapter heading, each of the headings has the name of a species of fish which is particular to Tasmania, and the front piece for each chapter is one of these drawings which come from the title book. Gould's
And
Book
also
of
the
Fish.
inspiration for the characters in the book.
Absolutely. There's a link then between the chapter title and the discussion that's going on in the book. But it's a fascinating book in many respects because it's a creation of fiction, of course, but it purports to be a modern day recreation of a diary written many years ago by another convict. It's the story of his life, but it's through the eyes of a person who discovered his diary and then lost it, and so he's trying to recreate what he read in the diary. So it's a very multi-layered creation, but it deals with Tasmania's early days as a convict colony. The protagonist in the story was sent to the toughest penal colony, which is on the west coast of Tasmania, away from any other part of civilization. And part of the story is his escape from there and his attempt to find his way back to the rest of civilization, if the main part of Tasmania could be called civilization. It was still a pretty rough and ready town in those days. But it talks about his travels in what's now still a wilderness area, still a national park, very wild country, very mountainous. His encounters with Tasmanian Indigenous people. You mentioned Indigenous people there. They're a common theme in Australian literature. His relationship with a woman who's part Indigenous. So it's all done in a kind of a dream-like state, and it's consciously literary. He uses a very literary style. But that said, there's a very interesting story running through it. So it's a fascinating book, and it's one I've read several times, and I will read again.
But this combination of visual imagery and literature, and of a person who's kind of from the modern times, but talks about something that went past much before his times. Now, what do you feel as a reader was the inspiration for Flanagan to write something of this sort?
Well, he's making a comment on the human condition, but he's also making a comment on the origins of the place in which he lives, the colonial past, how the legacy of that past is still played out in contemporary Australian politics and Australians' approach to life and to government. So they're themes which are contemporary as well as drawn from the past. But it's also, like others of his books, it draws very much on the Tasmanian landscape. He's a very descriptive writer. So one of his earlier books was called Death of a River Guide, and that's about somebody who worked on the main river that flows through the part of the world that he's describing. And that itself has a history, part of Tasmania's political history. It was dammed to make a power station, and the clash between those who wanted the river left in its natural state and those who wanted the power to allow the country to industrialise. It's a classic struggle between the Greens and the.
That's true.
So it draws on all of those themes, I think, as his life does.
Your cinema is something that I watch most of all. I mean, I'm a big fan of so many films. As a kid, I watched Crocodile Dundee. As a young adult, I watched Moulin Rouge. So these are films that have really kind of marked different phases of my life. I'm speaking of on a very personal note. And I feel that Australian cinema, whether it be Picnic from a Hanging Rock or other important films, have really marked cinema all around the world. What do you feel as an Australian? Do you feel that Australian cinema still has a long way to go, or do you feel that it has achieved what it had to?
I don't think it's finished. I mean, I think cinema has to be a constant reflection of contemporary life, as well as having a history. And You know, Australia is not a huge market, therefore our capacity to produce big budget films is limited. So there's a history of films which deal with domestic national themes, as well as some of the ones which achieve much more international success.
Exactly, and even in Babe.
Yes, Babe is a great example.
Exactly.
Yeah. But there are others. I mean, there's for instance there's a film studio now based in Sydney where a lot of big Hollywood blockbusters are in fact made these days, because the skills of Australian cinematographers, of Australian set designers, we have a very good cadre of people who are very good at making movies, and they're used internationally. So, but these films are not Australian films; they're films made in Australia, and I make a bit of a distinction because they don't don't make any attempt to really use their local context to say something about
Picnic at Hanging Rock, Gallipoli, in fact.
Well, absolutely. These are Australian films. They deal with Australian themes. They may use international actors sometimes, but they deal with Australian themes and speak to an Australian audience. But because these themes are kind of universal, they can also appeal to international audiences as well.
Now, Mr. Hayward, music is also a very important part of life. I mean, it's used everywhere. The poetry is translated into music. The literature sometimes is translated into music. And of course, all cinema has music in one form or the other. What kind of music do you enjoy?
I'm a polyglot when it comes to music. I'm a keen amateur musician myself, so I like many types. I grew up in the Christian tradition. Every church has a choir, and when I was very young I used to sing in the choir, so my musical grounding is that. But I play the flute, I play percussion instruments, and I sing.
And I've seen you.
You have, yeah. Yes. But so I like all sorts of music. I still like the sort of music I grew up with, but and I like jazz as an instrumental player. But I also like, I guess, modern folk music, modern pop music. So anything that's good I like.
It depends on your mood, it depends on the feel, it depends on kind of how you relate to the music, just like you relate to your poetry and literature and film.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to have music on as a backdrop all the time. My wife prefers silence, so we always find an equilibrium somewhere. But
so it's good to have this kind of a little bit of a change between the husband and wife, because that's what keeps it going, as I might say.
Absolutely.
But what is your favorite music or musician?
Well, I thought about this when you asked me about doing the show, and there are so many Australian musicians that I admire a lot. But the one that springs to mind is a songwriter called Paul Kelly, who's hails from Melbourne in Australia, and he's started out as a sort of a rocker with a band. But these days he's much more, he still plays with a band a lot of the time, but he can also do solo shows, and he's been a prolific writer. His songs are quite simple harmonically usually, they're not complicated musically, but he's poetic in his use of language, very simple stories that he tells, images that he conveys. A little like the Macaulay poem. It's simple, short, but makes you think afterwards. And he's also quite political. I mean, he's written some overtly political songs. One famous one of his is called "From Little Things, Big Things Grow," and it's about the Aboriginal land rights movement. But many others that deal with much more universal themes: love, family, life. Drug addiction is because he's like many rock musicians. He got involved in drugs and then survived to go on with his life. A lot of his songs are very self-consciously set in Australian settings too. There's a rivalry in Australia between Sydney and Melbourne, which is the sort of, and they represent different sorts of cultures, a bit like Karachi and Lahore in Pakistan, I guess, different styles of looking at the world, and some of his songs deal with that too, because he's lived in both cities. So I think he's the most representative. I wouldn't say at any given moment, he's my favourite, but he's an Australian musician and songwriter of whom I can feel proud and
well,
whom I love.
I think I'll go home and definitely search him through and have a listen to him and kind of try to understand where you're coming from.
Please do.
We, of course, were in conversation with Mr. Peter Hayward, who, of course, gave his personal interpretation and his personal likings for poetry, for literature, and, of course, for cinema in Australia. Well, life is all about the simple things. It's about the small, minute things that we somehow sometimes ignore. I think if we kind of put more attention towards the little things, it would bring more joy to us and to our lives. Omar Khalid Bhatt bids you farewell from this episode of The Classics Show. And of course, before we leave, I'd like to thank you so much, Peter Hayward, to have come again to another of my shows and to have given us the time to talk about literature and poetry. It's a bit different from what you do, that is politics, but I think it's more, how should I say, it kind of takes you out from that mold and also makes us understand what Australian literature, poetry and cinema is all about. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.
And so we bid you farewell from this episode. We'll be back next week. Same time, same channel. Stay tuned.
Now a man comes up from amongst the throng, takes a young boy's hand, and his hand is strong. And the child feels safe, yeah, the child feels brave, as he's carrying those arms up and over the wave. Deeper water,